If you've watched Pawn Stars, you know the gold and silver pawn shop is full of surprises. But none of the odd collectibles or strange customer stories ever came close to what happened during a quiet renovation project in the back of the shop. What started as a simple remodel turned into something straight out of a conspiracy thriller. The discovery was so shocking that the FBI had to get involved, because what they found under the floor would leave everyone stunned. Rick Harrison had decided to upgrade one of the older and used sections of the building. This particular room had always been more of a storage space than part of the main shop, used mostly for overstock, broken items, and things that never made it to the showroom. The floorboards were old, creaky, and warped from decades of use. It was the kind of space you wouldn't think twice about until the contractors ripped it open. Beneath the boards, they found something unexpected, not concrete or insulation, but a sealed metal hatch. It was hidden just below the floorboards, completely covered in dust and cobwebs. The bolts were rusted over, and the handle had clearly not been touched in decades. This wasn't part of any known renovation. It wasn't listed in any building plans. It was completely out of place. Rick was immediately intrigued. At first, he thought it might be some kind of old storm shelter or forgotten safe. But the shape was odd. It was square, reinforced, and deeply embedded into the subfloor. It looked more like a vault than anything else. As they pried it open with a crowbar and an angle grinder, a cold draft of stale air rushed out. Inside was a dark compartment packed with rows of old boxes. The boxes weren't labeled in any normal way. Some had faded military codes. Others were wrapped in waxed cloth or taped shut with heavy-duty metal clamps. One in particular stood out, a wooden crate stenciled with U.S. property, "Do not open, 1942. At that moment, Rick's instincts kicked in. This wasn't an old merchandise shipment or a forgotten stash of pawned goods. This was something much bigger, potentially dangerous. He knew there were rules about handling government-marked materials, especially anything military or historical. So instead of poking around further, he did something he'd never done before. He called the FBI. Within hours, agents arrived quietly and sealed off the area. Their tone was serious. No joking, no smiling, just straight to business. They carefully began examining the boxes. One agent was overheard saying, "This isn't just lost inventory. This is something they buried and never wanted found." And just like that, the pawn shop transformed from a quirky Las Vegas business into the center of a government-level mystery. The moment the FBI showed up, everything changed. What was once a casual renovation turned into a full-scale operation. Rick, Corey, and Chum Lee watched in disbelief as plainclothes agents roped off the entire back section of the pawn shop. Customers were quietly asked to leave early that day, and the shop was officially closed until further notice. No explanations were given to the public, just a vague maintenance issue sign taped to the front door. Inside, the energy shifted from curious to downright eerie. Rick had dealt with valuable artifacts before: Civil War weapons, rare military medals, even old mob memorabilia. But never had he stumbled upon something that required federal intervention. The unearthed boxes were being handled like radioactive material, and the look on the agents' faces made it clear they weren't expecting to find this. Each box was photographed, documented, and carefully extracted. Some were so heavy they needed 2 agents to carry them. The materials inside appeared aged, judging by the dust and corrosion, but none of it looked like ordinary junk. Several crates bore matching serial codes, stamped with military-grade ink and partially obscured by time. There were rumors, whispers among the workers, that one crate had biohazard markings. But no one was confirming anything. Rick stood by, trying to remain calm. As curious as he was, the FBI wasn't exactly offering a play-by-play. When he tried to ask a few questions, one of the lead agents responded flatly, "Mr. Harrison, this is now a matter of national security. We appreciate your cooperation." That was it. No more details. No room for negotiation. Chum Lee, trying to lighten the mood, joked about how the hatch looked like something from Stranger Things. No one laughed. Corey, always the skeptic, muttered that the whole thing felt like it was being blown out of proportion, until he saw the agents scanning the area with radiation detectors. That's when the gravity of the situation really sank in. As the FBI brought in more equipment, metal detectors, sample kits, and even dogs trained for explosives, rumors began to swirl. Was this Cold War-era weaponry? Stolen military artifacts? Lost intelligence documents? Theories flew fast, but no answers were given. That night, a special mobile lab was parked behind a shop. Agents worked under portable lights well into the early morning. Rick barely slept, pacing around his office, trying to remember if there had ever been anything in the building's history that could explain a sealed underground compartment. He couldn't recall anything. Not a word from previous owners. No blueprint indicating a vault. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to hide this section of the building from the world. By sunrise, the FBI had sealed several crates and loaded them into black vans. One box, wrapped tighter than the rest, was held back. The team gathered around it quietly, speaking in hushed tones. Rick wasn't told what was inside, only that it would be transported under escort to a secure facility. Whatever it wasn't meant to be found. But now it was out, and it was just the beginning. As the FBI packed up and vanished without a trace, Rick was left standing in his own shop, feeling like a stranger in a place he'd practically grown up in. The gold and silver pawn shop was more than just a business, it was a legacy. But now, part of that legacy seemed tied to a history he never knew existed. And Las Vegas, a city built on secrets, was starting to show its cracks. Word began to spread, not through official channels, of course, but through whispers. A few construction workers who had helped uncover the vault couldn't keep quiet. One of them mentioned seeing strange paperwork with World War II dates. Another swore he spotted a file with a name operation paperclip on it. That alone was enough to set off a storm of speculation. For those who aren't familiar, Operation Paperclip was a real post-war initiative by the U.S. government to bring Nazi scientists to America after World War II. It's been the subject of countless documentaries and conspiracy theories, many claiming that files were destroyed or hidden to cover up darker truths. Could the hidden vault have contained records from that era? If so, why were they buried beneath a pawn shop? Rick tried to brush off the gossip. But when a retired military historian stopped by the next day, asking to speak with him, his curiosity got the better of him. The historian, Dr. Alan Crow, claimed he had spent years researching hidden military installations in the western U.S., and that the pawn shop's location matched up with a decommissioned intelligence relay point from the 1950s. This entire stretch of the city, Crow explained, was once part of a Cold War communication network. Messages came in, got decoded, then rerouted. The government used front companies and unmarked buildings to do the dirty work. It was designed to be forgotten. Rick listened carefully. He'd never heard anything like it before. According to Crow, some of these relay points were repurposed or built over. Most were stripped clean, but a few may have been sealed with materials still inside, hidden for decades beneath new construction. If that was true, then Rick's building wasn't just a pawn shop. It was sitting on top of a Cold War artifact. A buried facility, hidden in plain sight. Crow wanted access to the site, but Rick had to decline. The FBI had warned him not to let anyone else near it. Still, Crow left behind a thick folder of declassified maps and files, highlighting other places in Las Vegas with similar anomalies. Rick spent the next several nights reading through every page. Each document raised more questions than it answered. There were mentions of recovered artifacts, coded transmissions, and even storage for sensitive biological materials. One file simply read, "Classified, level Omega clearance required." Suddenly, Rick wasn't just dealing with dusty boxes or forgotten merchandise. He was entangled in a legacy of espionage, cover-ups, and government secrets, the kind of story people disappear over. And whatever the FBI had taken, it clearly wasn't junk. Days passed after the FBI's initial sweep, but the questions surrounding the mysterious vault and its contents didn't subside. Rick's life, once dominated by the everyday hustle of running a pawn shop, had now become a tangled mess of secrets and theories. As he stood behind the counter serving customers, his mind kept wandering back to those crates. What had the FBI taken? What was in that wooden box stamped U.S. property? Do not open, 1942? Was this some kind of elaborate government cover-up? Or was he just an unwilling participant in a larger conspiracy? Rick wasn't the only one whose mind was racing. A few days after the FBI's removal of the boxes, an unexpected visitor showed up, a government agent, but not from the FBI. This man, in a nondescript black suit, introduced himself as an agent from the Department of Homeland Security. His presence raised the stakes. If the FBI had been involved, why was DHS getting involved now? The agent, who gave his name as Agent Walker, wasted no time. He wanted to speak to Rick privately. The shop was unusually quiet that morning, as there were no customers around, and the staff was busy elsewhere. Walking into Rick's office, Agent Walker closed the door behind him and sat down with a serious expression. "Mr. Harrison," he began, "I'm here to give you an update. What we're dealing with goes much deeper than we initially thought." Rick leaned forward, listening intently. He had no idea what was coming next, but his gut told him this wasn't just about a few old documents or some forgotten crates. The air in the room felt thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. "You've heard of Operation Paperclip, correct?" Walker asked, his voice low. Rick nodded, unsure of where this was going. "Yeah, I've heard the rumors. Some of the crates you saw opened," Walker continued, "contain materials directly tied to that operation. But they also contained classified military documents that were never meant to be discovered." Rick felt a chill run down his spine. "So, what does that mean for me?" Walker leaned forward. "It means that what was hidden under your floor isn't just an old relic. It's connected to a network of underground operations run during the Cold War. A network that was intended to stay buried." The agent explained that one of the boxes contained not just documents, but detailed blueprints for a facility, a hidden research base located just outside Las Vegas. The base, which was supposed to be decommissioned decades ago, had allegedly been used for biological experiments and research on advanced weapons. The documents referenced Project Genesis, a secret military project tied to the development of chemical agents for warfare. The most unsettling detail: Rick's pawn shop was located on land that had once been part of this secret military facility. The vault wasn't just an old safe. It was part of a much larger cover-up that had lasted for over half a century. Rick struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. "So, this stuff has been buried right under my shop this whole time?" Walker nodded grimly. "It's not just history anymore, Mr. Harrison. It's a ticking time bomb." The gravity of Agent Walker's words hung heavily in the air, and Rick felt as if the ground beneath him had suddenly become unsteady. A secret military base, buried beneath the shop he'd spent years running, connected to a covert operation involving chemical agents and biological warfare. It was like something straight out of a spy thriller, and yet it was happening right under his nose. But there was more to the story. Agent Walker had left him with a crucial detail that didn't sit right, a detail that made everything feel even more sinister. Rick wasn't just the owner of a pawn shop. He was now connected to something far bigger, something that could turn dangerous at any moment. The vault and the mysterious documents weren't just part of a hidden military operation. They were key to unlocking the final pieces of a much more extensive puzzle. "Mr. Harrison, this isn't just about the past," Walker had said before leaving. "This project, Project Genesis, was never really abandoned. People in the government don't like to talk about it. But it didn't disappear. It just went underground." Rick spent the next few days combing through everything he could find about the operation and its supposed connections to the secret biological research site. With each passing hour, he uncovered more pieces of the puzzle. The project wasn't just an isolated experiment. It had connections to multiple sites across the U.S., all buried under different layers of cover-ups, with deep ties to certain influential individuals who had been involved in government and military operations for decades. Even some major players in the world of organized crime had been linked to these facilities, their role in smuggling scientific research and materials out of the country in exchange for protection or funding. But it was the connections to Las Vegas that struck Rick the hardest. According to some of the sources he'd found, the city had been the perfect location for these shadowy operations. Situated near a military testing ground, surrounded by deserts and remote areas, Vegas had always been a haven for secrecy. Now, it seemed like the entire city had once been involved in a much darker game than anyone could have imagined. Rick was still trying to process it all when something even more unsettling came to light. Late one night, a former employee of the pawn shop, who had left years ago, reached out to him. He was terrified and wanted to meet in person. When they met the next day, the former employee, a man named Tyler, wasted no time. "Rick, I've been hearing rumors about the shop, about what was found under the floor. But that's not the worst part." Tyler glanced nervously over his shoulder, as if someone might be watching them. "A couple of years ago, I stumbled across something in the back room. Old files, some of them with military insignia. I didn't know what they were at the time. But after everything that's happened, I know now." Rick felt a surge of panic. "What do you mean?" Tyler continued. "There's a connection to someone in your family. Someone who used to work there. Someone who was involved in the original operations. Your grandfather, Rick. He was part of something huge. Rick's heart raced as he processed Tyler's words. His grandfather. The man he had always considered a quiet, simple figure in his life, someone who had built the foundation of the pawn shop, was suddenly tied to a secret military operation? It didn't make sense. The man had never once mentioned any involvement in anything remotely covert or sinister. Tyler's face was pale as he handed Rick a small, crumpled envelope. I found this in an old file folder tucked away in the back of the storage room. It's a letter addressed to your grandfather, but it's not from anyone you would expect. Rick took the envelope, his hand shaking slightly as he peeled it open. Inside was a letter written in official government language, stamped with a series of faded, red ink codes Rick didn't recognize. The letter was dated back to 1963, and it addressed his grandfather by his full name, a name Rick had never heard before. In the letter, it confirmed that his grandfather had been part of Project Genesis, assigned to a special team involved in testing and maintaining the covert biological agents stored on military bases. As Rick read further, it became apparent that his grandfather's involvement was much deeper than he had ever imagined. He had been tasked with overseeing the transportation of sensitive materials, some of which, according to the letter, had been dangerous and experimental in nature. The letter also referenced his grandfather's role in facilitating the disposal of materials with potential for adverse environmental impact, a statement that seemed eerily vague. The more Rick read, the more the pieces started to fit together. His grandfather hadn't just worked on a military project, he had been part of the logistics team that managed the distribution and eventual concealment of these dangerous biological agents. The agents had been moved to various storage sites, including one buried beneath the pawn shop in Las Vegas. Rick's mind swirled with disbelief. He had spent years believing that his grandfather had been a simple man, living an honest life. But the truth was far more complicated. His grandfather, who had been instrumental in the founding of the pawn shop, was a key player in a secret government project tied to biological warfare. And now that hidden history had come back to haunt Rick. He looked up from the letter, his thoughts racing. But why didn't anyone ever tell me? He asked Tyler, his voice barely above a whisper. Why keep this from me? Tyler shook his head, his face etched with concern. I don't know, Rick. Maybe your grandfather didn't want you to know. Maybe he didn't want to drag you into this. But now it's all coming to light. Just as Rick was about to speak, a sharp knock echoed from the front door of the shop. Tyler looked nervous, and Rick could feel his stomach tighten. Who could it be at this hour? Was it the government again? Or had someone connected to the operation finally caught up to him? The knock repeated, more urgent this time. The tension in the air thickened, and for the first time, Rick felt like he was on the verge of uncovering something much darker than he had ever bargained for. Rick hesitated, the knock echoing through the stillness of the shop, sending an uneasy chill down his spine. His thoughts were racing. Tyler's warning lingered in the air, but this was more than just the revelation about his grandfather. Something else was happening, and the urgency in the knock told him it wasn't just coincidence. I'll check it out, Rick said quietly, trying to steady his voice. Tyler nodded, his expression full of concern, and followed Rick to the front of the store, keeping a cautious distance. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the walls, but Rick could still make out the familiar shapes of antiques and priceless objects scattered throughout the store. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Rick's hand rested on the doorknob, but before he could turn it, a voice from the other side rang out. Mr. Harrison, it's Agent Walker. We need to talk. Open up. Rick froze. Agent Walker? The man who had warned him about the dangers of the project, the one who had been monitoring his every move since the discovery of the vault under the shop. He hadn't expected to hear from him so soon, not after everything that had already unfolded. Was this another twist in the story, or had they finally come to collect on the secrets Rick now held? Taking a deep breath, Rick opened the door, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the hallway outside. Agent Walker stood there, his hands in his coat pockets, his face as unreadable as ever. You're not alone, Walker said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He glanced briefly at Tyler, who immediately tensed. You're going to want to hear this, Mr. Harrison. This is bigger than you think. Rick glanced at Tyler, who gave him a look of silent agreement. They both knew there was no turning back now. Whatever Walker had to say, it was clear the situation had escalated far beyond any of their expectations. Walker turned and closed the door behind him, locking it with a soft click. I can't keep this under wraps any longer, he said, lowering his voice. "We've been monitoring the site, and we've picked up something that could change everything. The vault under the floor isn't just part of an old project. It's connected to something more dangerous. It's active again, and it's time for you to know exactly what we're dealing with." Rick felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean, active again?" he asked, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. This was starting to sound more like a nightmare than an investigation. Walker's expression darkened. The chemicals stored beneath this very shop have been reactivated. And they're not just biological agents anymore. They've evolved. We think someone has found a way to weaponize them. Tyler's eyes widened. "You're telling me the military was experimenting with bioweapons down there? And now they're, what, alive?" Walker nodded slowly. "That's exactly what we think. Whoever has access to this facility has figured out how to turn those agents into something much more lethal than anyone could have imagined. And they're not working alone. There's a larger network involved, and we believe they've been using your shop as a cover." Rick's mind reeled. His shop, his grandfather's legacy, had become a central point in a deadly game of military experimentation and covert operations. How had it gone from a family business to a hub of national security concerns? Walker's gaze hardened. "Mr. Harrison, you've been caught in the middle of something that's much bigger than you, and it's not just a matter of uncovering hidden secrets anymore. The people who want those biological agents aren't going to let you stand in their way." Rick's mind was reeling, but Agent Walker's words cut through the fog of confusion. "You need to understand, Mr. Harrison, this isn't just about your grandfather's secret project anymore. Whoever is behind this has resources far beyond what we imagined. They've been using your shop as a cover, but their eyes are set on something far larger. Something that could put the entire country at risk." The words hit Rick like a ton of bricks. His shop, a place he had spent his life building, was now the focal point of a national security threat. He had been so focused on uncovering the secrets buried beneath the floor, but he never imagined that those secrets could have evolved into something this dangerous. Tyler was standing beside him, his face pale, unable to hide his shock. "You mean to tell me that these bioagents could cause a massive disaster? Right here, in Las Vegas?" Walker's gaze flicked toward Tyler, then back to Rick. "Not just Las Vegas. If these agents fall into the wrong hands, we're talking about a biological disaster on a global scale. These aren't just pathogens. They've been engineered for a purpose. And whoever controls them, controls the future." Rick swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked down at the letter from his grandfather, still clutched in his hand. It all seemed too surreal, too impossible. How had something so dangerous been hidden for so long, right under his nose? "There's more," Walker continued, his tone grim. "We've been investigating a series of deaths connected to the project. People who knew too much have been silenced, and there are whispers of an underground organization trying to gain control of these agents. The person pulling the strings is still in the shadows, but we're certain they've been active for years, and their reach is expanding." Rick's stomach churned. "So, this isn't just about my grandfather's past? Someone is still operating this program." "That's right," Walker confirmed. "And they know about you. They know you're involved, and they'll stop at nothing to get what they want. They've been watching you, Mr. Harrison. And now that you've uncovered the truth, you're a target." The weight of Walker's words settled heavily on Rick's shoulders. His life, his business, and everything he thought he knew about his family's legacy were now in jeopardy. Whoever was behind this wasn't just some shadowy government agency. They were a powerful force that had been pulling strings for decades. "We need your help," Walker said, his voice low and urgent. "This is bigger than any of us, and we need you to cooperate. We can't let these agents get out into the world. We need to find out who's behind this and stop them before it's too late." Rick could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had no choice. The pawn shop had always been his life, but now it was tied to something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The game had changed, and there was no turning back. Rick had never imagined his life could change so quickly. Just days ago, he was running a relatively quiet pawn shop, managing the ups and downs of business and family. But now he was caught in a deadly game, and every move mattered. The clock was ticking, and the walls were closing in. Agent Walker's words echoed in his mind, but the urgency was clear. The biological agents had to be contained, and the people behind their creation were dangerous, maybe even more dangerous than Rick realized. But the real question was, who could he trust? Walker had been helpful so far, but was he part of the solution or part of the conspiracy? As Rick stood in the dimly lit shop, the weight of the situation pressed on him. Tyler was pacing back and forth, his nerves getting the best of him. We need to figure out who these people are, Rick. We need to get ahead of this before it's too late. Rick nodded, feeling a mixture of dread and determination. I know Tyler, but where do we even start? We have no idea who's pulling the strings. All we have is the vault, and whatever's still down there. Walker interrupted, his face pale but resolute. We have a lead, but it's risky. We need to get to the location where the agents are being stored. It's not far from here, but the moment we step into that building, we're in the crosshairs. Rick felt a cold sweat forming. He knew they were playing with fire, but there was no turning back now. They had to find out what they were up against, and the only way to do that was to go straight into the lion's den. We'll go, Rick said, his voice firm. But we need to be careful. Whoever is behind this isn't going to let us get close without a fight. Tyler stopped pacing and turned to Rick, his eyes wide. You sure about this, Rick? We're talking about dangerous people, people who've already killed to cover their tracks. Rick didn't answer immediately. The reality of the situation was sinking in. The shop wasn't just a business anymore. It was a battleground, and he and his team were now the target. But he couldn't back down. Too much was at stake, his family, his legacy, and the truth about what had really been happening under his roof. I'm sure, Rick said finally, locking eyes with Tyler. If we're going to stop this, we need to go after them. No more hiding. We can't wait for someone else to take action. This is on us. The three of them, united by common purpose, set off toward the building where the agents were hidden. The streets of Las Vegas had never felt so ominous, each shadow seeming to conceal an unknown threat. As they neared the location, a feeling of tension built in Rick's chest. The world felt smaller, more dangerous, and every corner they turned could be their last. Walker led the way, glancing over his shoulder occasionally, as if expecting someone to be following them. Stay sharp, he murmured. We don't know how many people are involved, but we're not alone in this. Rick could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded them. The chase had begun, and there was no telling how far it would take them or how many lives would be at stake. The building loomed before them, dark and intimidating. Rick's heart was racing as they approached the entrance, each step heavier than the last. This was it. The moment they would either expose the truth or disappear into the shadows forever. Walker led them inside, his eyes scanning every corner, his senses on high alert. We're close, he muttered. Stay tight and don't make any noise. The silence in the building was deafening. As they moved through the maze of corridors, Rick couldn't help but feel like they were walking into a trap. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the overhead light sent a chill down his spine. There was something unnatural about this place, something that felt wrong from the very start. They reached a heavy steel door at the end of a narrow hallway. Walker stopped and turned to them. This is it. Whatever happens in here, we're all in this together. Are you ready? Rick swallowed hard. He nodded, but his mind was racing. He had no idea what they would find inside, but he knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Walker turned the handle, and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was cold, almost sterile. Rows of metal shelves lined the walls, each one holding a collection of strange, unmarked containers. The air smelled of chemicals, and the faint hum of machines filled the silence. Rick's eyes widened as he stepped closer to one of the shelves. The containers were unlike anything he had ever seen before. These are the agents, Walker said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Biological weapons. Engineered to be silent and deadly. Rick reached out to touch one of the containers, but before he could make contact, a voice echoed from behind them. You should have never come here. Rick spun around, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the doorway was a man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by a shadow. Who are you? Rick demanded, his voice shaking with both fear and anger. The man smirked, stepping into the light. You don't know who I am, but I know who you are, Mr. Harrison. I've been watching you, and I've been waiting for you to get curious. Rick felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment he had been dreading, the person behind it all, the mastermind who had been pulling the strings. The man's cold eyes gleamed as he took another step forward. "I'm afraid you're too late," the man said, his voice almost taunting. "This project was never meant to be uncovered. And now it's too dangerous for anyone to know the truth." Just as the tension in a room reached its peak, Agent Walker stepped forward, his hands slipping into his jacket. "You don't control this anymore," he said, his voice firm. "This ends now." The man's smirk faltered, and for the first time, a flicker of panic flashed in his eyes. But before he could react, Walker pulled a small device from his jacket and activated it. A loud whirring noise filled the air, and within seconds, alarms blared, red lights flashing overhead. "This is over," Walker said, his expression unwavering. "You're under arrest." The man lunged, but Tyler was already on him, pinning him to the ground. Rick felt a rush of relief, though it was short-lived. The truth had finally been exposed, but the damage had already been done. The project was out in the open, and the fallout would be far-reaching. As the authorities arrived to take the man into custody, Rick looked around at the room filled with dangerous secrets. The building might have been empty of answers, but the real work was just beginning. The agents were contained, but the people behind them were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to keep their power. Rick turned to Walker. "What happens now?" Walker gave a grim smile. "Now we fight. We protect what's left. And we make sure nothing like this ever happens again." As Rick and his team left the building, the weight of everything they had uncovered still hung heavy on their shoulders. The world would never be the same, but one thing was clear: they had stopped something far worse from happening. The truth had been revealed, and the battle was far from over.